The Middle East is a nexus between Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's also the gateway to the Persian Gulf, and itself is a tremendous source of oil, which is indispensable for the sustenance of our economy and our military organization. So it's a very, very important region, and gradually, if you look in retrospect over the last 10 years, you'll see that the United States and Western influence is gradually being driven out of that strategic area. Iraq is a satellite of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has poured billions of dollars into Iraq. And even though it is now at war with Iran, and the Soviet Union is getting closer and closer to Iran, it is still a Soviet ally, and we should consider it at all times in that perspective. You see, if you go from the Mediterranean to Syria, and then through Iraq, you're right into the Persian Gulf. That is a passage to the Persian Gulf from the Mediterranean. And this is a very, very strategic aspect of that particular country. South Yemen is so strategic and so important that it's hard to understand its importance. The British occupied Aden, the capital of South Yemen, 100 years ago, because they knew that if you dominate Aden, you dominate the passage to the Red Sea and therefore to the Suez Canal and to the Mediterranean. And they held that for years. And then they decided on a new policy of retreat and retrenchment, and they gave up Aden, and of course the Soviets moved right into the vacuum. Not only have the Soviets a friendship treaty with South Yemen is a hardcore ally of the Soviet Union. There's a Soviet naval base at Aden. There's a Soviet naval air base right nearby. And of almost greatest importance is the fact that the passage into the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean is through the Bab el-Mandeb, which is a 20-mile passage leading into the Red Sea. Right in the center of that, you have Perim Island. Perim Island is now manned by Soviet troops. There's a Soviet commander there, and it's a complete blockage into the Red Sea. Syria is a very important ally of the Soviet Union. It is strategically located right on the Mediterranean. It has two very important ports, Tartus and Latakia, which is regular Soviet ports of call. After the Israelis destroyed the Syrian Air Force in the 1982 war, the Soviets have put billions and billions of dollars of military equipment in there with surface-to-air missiles. And it is totally now the dominant force in Lebanon.
In the spring of 1978, communist-trained Afghan officers seized the Afghanistan presidential palace. The coup d'etat was successful, and before the Afghan people were completely aware of the coup, the Marxist military turned the government over to the civilian Afghan Communist Party. They speedily consolidated their power over the entire country. Resistance to the Marxist-Leninist puppet government led to the 1979 invasion of 120,000 armed Soviet troops, supported by tanks and fighter planes. Despite the courageous effort of the Mujahideen and other Afghan freedom fighters, the Soviet troops slaughtered over 1 million Afghans. Adding to an additional 5 million who fled, many of whom are now in Pakistan, we reach a total that approaches half of the population. One of the refugee children I interviewed made this chilling observation of the communist bloodletting. In every war, he said, children are the victims. In Afghanistan, we are the targets. Pakistan is a Muslim country with strong ties to the United States. On its southern borders is India, strongly antagonistic to Pakistan. Soviet influence in India is extensive. Their air force is equipped with MiG fighters and their army with modern Soviet technology. India has formed close diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. India cannot be categorized as a red satellite. However, it can be ranked as a much closer ally to the Soviets than the United States. Marxist-Leninist ideology had been at work in Latin America long before the decision was made to take over operations in Cuba and Nicaragua. Heavy communist influence and infiltration had been experienced throughout South and Central America. Revolutions, skirmishes were common amongst the so-called banana republics in South America, but a special kind of trouble was brewing in the late 1950s. In 1957, important segments of the American press were drawn to a small band of rough and ragged guerrillas, led by the bearded revolutionary Fidel Castro and his henchman, Che Guevara. Network television crews were sent to the Cuban mountains to bring back documentaries about this 26 Julio movement. Reporters and their camera crews sent back filmed reports that pictured Castro as a romantic rebel, a Robin Hood leading the fight for social justice. The accounts went out of the way to downgrade Castro's Marxist-Leninist associations. Americans were soon to hear Castro described as the George Washington of Cuba, and, as New York Times writer Herbert Matthews put it, the most remarkable and romantic figure to arise in Cuba since Jose Marti, hero of Cuba's War of Independence. In a brief but giddy visit to Cuba for a filmed interview, a gullible Ed Sullivan said to Castro, "The people of the United States have a great admiration for you and your men because you are in the real American tradition of George Washington." The film was shown to 30 million American television viewers. In the midst of the Castro media buildup, knowledgeable students of Marxist-Leninism warned Americans of Castro and the fact his lieutenants were known Marxist-Leninist agents. Quickly smothering the warnings, the press ridiculed and scoffed at those who raised them. Americans were told in a widely circulated Catholic newspaper that, despite what you may have read, the Cuban rebels are not communists. There is absolutely no doubt about Fidel Castro. There is no communist indoctrination in the rebel forces, not even the slightest degree of communist propaganda. His popularity soaring, money, arms, and ammunition began flowing into Castro's mountain hideout. With his bloodthirsty band of guerrillas swollen in size, better armed, and with the fawning American journalist in tow, Castro began the journey to Havana, picking up new recruits with each mile. Swept up in the romanticized reporting of Castro's march, demands were soon heard for the withdrawal of all aid to the Batista government. The ever-present Communist Front organizations led the leftist hue and cry, "Down with Batista." U.S. governmental officials, members of Congress, and the media joined in the general chorus. With the worst possible timing for the anti-communist forces in Cuba, the U.S. government proceeded with an embargo exactly as it had done in the shameful betrayal of Chiang Kai-shek. Without bullets for their guns and stripped of all support, the Batista government fell before the Castro onslaught. Despite the Marxist-Leninist program of murder, terror, and deportation that followed the communist takeover, a large segment of the American press continued to hail Castro as a liberation hero. The romance with Castro's victory ended when, in the spring of 1960, the prestigious U.S. News and World Report declared that communists had indeed established a mammoth stronghold just 90 miles from American shores. As missile-based construction began in the Oriente province, the Soviets sent their number 2 man, Mikoyan, to Cuba, where he exercised the Brezhnev doctrine in announcing Soviet Russia's plans to provide jet fighters and other armaments for the new communist state. A beachhead for the international Marxist-Leninist movement had finally been established in the Western Hemisphere, 90 miles from the United States. Investigations led to a U.S. Senate investigation. The Senate Internal Security Report of September 1960 declared, "Cuba was handed to Castro and the communists in the same way that China was handed to the communists." The fall of Cuba was a big step forward in establishing a base from which communist agitation and propaganda could be exported throughout Latin America. An important element in Lenin's plan for Europe, Asia, and encirclement of the United States was now firmly in place.